early transoceanic navigation, which will be presented by James and Jim. So whichever of you is first, please take it away.
Thank you, Thomas. Picture the Atlantic Ocean in the 1400s, wide, unknown, and largely unchallenged by Europeans. There were no accurate charts, no way to measure longitude to know just how far west you'd sailed. Just wind, waves, wooden holes, courage, and perhaps a certain amount of dumb luck. And into this watery void marched the kingdoms of Europe, desperate for a way around the rising Ottoman Empire and the old maritime trading monopolies of Genoa and Venice. This is the story of the first true arms race on the open sea. In 1453, Constantinople falls. Trade from Asia, such as spices, silks, and all manner of Oriental luxuries, become expensive, restricted, and unpredictable to obtain. Europe has two choices: find a new route or fall behind. Portugal takes the lead. Under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, their caravels creep down the west coast of Africa. They settled the mid-Atlantic Azores in the 1420s, Cape Verde off the African coast in the 1450s, and slowly they learn the behavior of the Atlantic wind systems. Spain watches from the sidelines, busy conquering the Canary Islands themselves throughout the 1400s, until they see what these discoveries mean. By mid-century, Portuguese and Spanish sailors have discovered a powerful secret. The Atlantic is not chaos, it is a machine. Up north around the Azores, winds blow eastward, making westbound travel tedious, if not impossible. Down south, near the Canaries and the Cape Verde, they blow west, out into the vast unexplored ocean. These patterns, called the Volta del Mar, or the turn of the sea, allow sailors to ride a predictable conveyor belt across the ocean. This is ultimately how Columbus does it. On 4 voyages, he stops at either the Canaries or Cape Verde, catches the westbound winds, and lets the Atlantic carry him like a massive river. Europe suddenly realizes an amazing fact: the ocean is crossable. But success across the Atlantic brings conflict. In 1494, Spain and Portugal nearly come to blows over these new lands. So the Valentian Pope Alexander VI brokers a deal. He draws a line down the map, 370 leagues west of Cape Verde. Everything west goes to Spain, everything east to Portugal. The Treaty of Tordesillas turns the entire world into a 2-player game. Every coastline, every island, every unknown shore, divided now between Spain and Portugal. Obviously, the other European powers weren't going to be bound by this restriction. Whether Catholic France or Protestant England or Holland, other powers were primed to settle the New World in short order. And this rush to build overseas empires supercharges the race for ships, ports, and maps. To cross the Atlantic, and more importantly, to return safely, Europe needs better naval technology. Shipbuilders transform from aging cog-style ships into sleek new designs. Caravels that can tack into the wind, carracks and naus big enough to survive long voyages and withstand high waves, and eventually the mighty galleon, the premier example of naval technological advancement, purpose-built for war and ocean travel. Mixed rigging appears: square sails for power, lateen triangular sails for maneuverability. More masts, deeper holes, stronger timbers when building these fleets designed to conquer the New World. Every new voyage pushes the technology forward. But even with better ships, sailors still need to know where they are. They use the improved magnetic compass. They use the astrolabe and the quadrants to fix latitude. And they use the cross staff and the back staff to measure the sun's angle. When all else fails, they use dead reckoning, estimating their position by speed, direction, and hope. But cumulative estimation errors lead to being miles off course, or worse, dashing your fleet into shallow shoals. This is because accurately determining your longitude remains a mystery, unsolved until the 1700s. For the early explorers, finding approximate longitude is less a science and more an educated gamble, a gamble that often led to disastrous payoffs. But regardless of these potential tragedies, every successful voyage becomes a geopolitical asset. Spain maintains the Padrón Real, a master map updated after every voyage. Portugal keeps an even more guarded chart, the Padrão Real, similar name, different kingdom. Both grand maps are locked away like nuclear launch codes. Each edition and relative position a carefully guarded secret to be kept from the competing empires intent on dominating the same newly discovered lands. To lose a map is to lose an empire. By the end of the 1400s, the Atlantic, once seen as an impassable expanse, has become a highway. Thanks to improved ships, mastered wind patterns, new tools, guarded maps, and the sheer nerve of sailors and captains involved, Europe's influence has burst beyond its borders. The age of exploration isn't just about discovering new lands. It's about mastering the ocean, the biggest, most dangerous frontier on Earth, and rewriting the map of the world forever. It took men of courage, men who didn't know if they would make it to the other side, or even if they would make it back home one day. These were brave European men who quite frankly possessed the sort of gumption that built not only the future nation known as the United States of America, but our entire modern world. Thank you.
Jim, you're up.
So the commencement of sustained European transatlantic voyaging in the late 15th century represents not just a sudden advent of exploratory zeal, not just courage, but it's the hard-won culmination of incremental advancements across multiple disciplines. Successful colonization required the prior convergence of interlocking systems, things like maritime technology capable of surviving open ocean passages, scientific methods for determining geographic position at sea, and certain geopolitical and economic structures that allowed for the financing and, even more importantly, the motivation of high-risk ventures. We're all familiar with some of the pre-Columbian expeditions to the New World, but we wouldn't see long-term colonization of the New World until the mid-15th century the mid to late 15th century for these reasons. So prior to the mid-15th century, dominant European designs were fundamentally unsuited for the demands of prolonged oceanic voyages. These are vessels that had their origin in northern European coastal and Baltic trade routes. They're pretty close to shore. Their primary deep water vessels, the cog and some of the earlier carracks, think of them more so as larger barges. They're intended primarily for trade. They're designed in the context of coastal trade and coastal conflict. They had what's called a high freeboard, or the height of the hull over the waterline. They had prominent superstructures, forecastles and stern castles that not only provided for defense in the sort of naval combat that existed at the time, which involved a lot of ramming and boarding and things of that nature, but it also provided extra storage. Now, when you start to take these ships out of coastal waters, that the fact that the vessel's center of gravity is relatively high, it catches wind, it rolls in violent seas, which makes them particularly dangerous in the open Atlantic, increasing the risk of capsizing or losing mass or things that would be certainly detrimental to the long-haul expeditions. The hull types themselves as well, the hull construction was important. Prior to the innovations, mostly by the Portuguese, but of the caravel and the galleon, many ships had what's called clinker-built or overlapping wooden planks riveted together, sort of akin to Viking longships. They're strong against blunt impacts. It created a relatively rigid hull, but that rigidity made it suffer from powerful hogging and sagging forces, they'd call them, or flexing of the hull convexly and concavely. Later Mediterranean ships and these early Atlantic Ocean going ships would have what they call carvel built hulls. The planks are laid end to end on a rigid skeleton frame, allows for larger, more flexible and watertight hulls. Rigging and sail configuration, as my colleague touched on, early cogs and early carracks were square rigged, meaning that they're only efficient when you're sailing downwind or with the wind directly astern. It performed poorly when sailing across the wind and was virtually incapable of sailing against it. You could change the orientation of the sail at this time, but it required sailors to go aloft in dangerous conditions, manipulate heavy yards, and reducing the sail area quickly was virtually impossible to do, leaving ships highly susceptible to sudden sea squalls. This was solved by the triangular shape sails that were earlier mentioned. Steering mechanisms also pretty darn important. So prior to the caravels, prior to these larger ocean-going ships that we're probably more familiar with, more prevalent than a stern rudder, as we would understand it, would be the use of a side steering oar or a side rudder mounted on one of the starboard quarters. Creates significant drag. It's imprecise. It relies on muscular control. Certainly not suited to volatile seas. So what are the solutions, right? Well, if you're going to design a ship that is able to go across the Atlantic or in any open ocean condition, you're going to need to do a couple of things that the Portuguese were able to accomplish. So they designed ships that had low profiles, sleek hulls, low freeboard, minimal superstructure, high speed, low drag, improving stability. It had a very long, very shallow draft. It was much more hydrodynamic, which is crucial for the exploration, not just of violent open ocean, but also of uncharted coastal and riverine environments where there are rocky bottoms on which you can easily gut the bottom of your ship. Sail plans had to change, as we spoke about as well. But there's also a sort of cognitive problem involved in navigation on a featureless ocean. So one of the things unique to our people's ability to navigate the oceans was their ability to solve higher order complex intellectual problems. So even if you had a capable vessel with it's futile, it's useless without the means to properly guide it in the open ocean. Reliable blue water navigation revolves around solving two distinct positional problems. So latitude, that's relatively easily solvable. They had worked it out centuries before Columbus navigated the ocean. Longitude is the larger of the two problems. So latitude is the north-south position that's achieved. You can achieve and determine what your latitude is through celestial observation. You had to have specific instruments, an astrolabe that was mentioned before. It's a heavy bronze ring, or it's mounted on a heavy bronze ring for stable use on a deck. Cross staffs and back staffs were allowed for the measuring of the angle of the sun or the North Star over the horizon, utilizing solar and stellar almanacs that had existed for a long period of time and required pretty extensive observation and deductive reasoning, such as Regiment of the Pole Star or Almanac Perpetuum, existed at the time. Refinement of the magnetic compass is also a key problem to solve. So the compass is in the same vein as gunpowder, where yes, these technologies were known for some time. Yes, they did have their origin, as best we can tell, in ancient China, but there's a very real difference between magnetizing an iron needle and creating a compass that's capable of assisting you with precise navigation and also capable of being used on a deck on an ocean-going vessel that's pitching and rolling and that sort of thing. So they created things to tackle these problems, such as dry pivot mounting. So no longer did you have to set your magnetized iron needle in a bowl of water. You can now mount it inside of a more portable fixture. They created things like the balance card, or we would know it more commonly as a compass rose or a wind rose. It's all well and good to know where north is, but you have to be able to take precise bearing with a degree of accuracy. So as far as it goes with latitude and longitude, the way you work out longitude, as I said earlier, is pretty easy on land. So they knew that there was a distinct difference between certain commonly observable celestial events, most commonly solstices, but they also used things like the movement of Jupiter's moon. And they knew if you could observe these two events and note the time in two specific locations, you could work the math back to determine rather easily, because both navigation and time are measured in base 60, the distance between a meridian, a known north-south parallel, and where you are.